Welcome, everyone. Thank you for showing up to support science this evening as we begin our fall series of Science on Tap. I'm Jen Scott. I use she, her pronouns, and together with Bob Herman, we organize science educational programs. Big thank you to Urban Artifact and Radio Artifact as our partners. Be sure to follow Radio Artifact and Urban Artifact. Let me try that again. Okay. Be sure to follow Radio Artifact on YouTube and Twitch to access previous Science on Tap programs as well as local independent musicians. Our speaker tonight is Jack Sutton, the Executive Director of Oak Heritage Conservancy. He's going to talk about the important work that they're doing. Both Science on Tap and Oak Heritage Conservancy are part of the Community Shares family of nonprofits working on real local change for the greater Cincinnati region. Please welcome Jack to the stage.
By a show of hands, how many of you have visited a national park? Wow, almost 100%. I think it's 100%. So we got park people in the audience, and that's great. Obviously, if you visit a national park, you've probably also been to state parks, county parks, city parks. Parks are an important part of our lives. I'm sure we all have very fond memories of visiting parks. And many of those parks, like our national parks, focus on protection of critical natural areas, maybe critical view sheds, something really unique to the landscape, to the habitat itself. And Grand Tetons National Park is a great example of one of those parks that's focusing on protection of a wide swath of natural area, majestic beauty, really an iconic image for us all to take home. Here in Cincinnati, Hamilton County, we're very fortunate that we have very strong park systems. City parks, county parks, throughout the metropolitan area, we have access to lots of parks and green space. But there are parts of this country that aren't as fortunate as areas like Cincinnati and really other communities across Ohio. But I'll tell you, there are a group of organizations nationwide that are doing the hard work to preserve green space, protect critical habitat. And if you combine all of those organizations together, would you believe that there's more acreage under protection by those groups than there are totaling our 63 national parks? It's an sung story about land trusts, and that's what I want to talk about this evening. So before I jump into land trusts, and I really want to talk about success stories for land trusts in general, I'll get to Oak Heritage obviously as well, but let me tell you a little bit about myself and my background and kind of where I come from. Again, my name is Jack Sutton. I'm currently the Executive Director for Oak Heritage Conservancy, which is a land trust that serves southeast Indiana. I've only been in that role about 18 months. I joined Oak Heritage at the beginning of 2022. My background is landscape architecture as training in academia, and early in my career I worked in the private sector for large-scale commercial private developments. I kind of took a pivot early in my career and went to work for Georgia State Parks, and that's where I have spent the majority of my professional career in the world of public parks and conservation. After 3.5 years in Atlanta and working all over Georgia, I and my wife wanted to move back to the Midwest. I grew up in the greater Cincinnati area, so we made it back, and I went to work for Great Parks of Hamilton County in 1989. First as a planning director, spent my more than 30 years there, and was very fortunate to spend the last 17 years serving as Great Parks Executive Director. I retired in 2019, kind of began some volunteering, and among that was with Oak Heritage Conservancy, and that kind of led me into this role that I am today. But more importantly, what are land trusts? Land trusts are nonprofit organizations that conserve unique land areas. There's many land trusts across the country. There's a lot of similarities among land trusts. Primarily, they protect natural areas, forest, meadows, wetlands, river corridors, farmland. Some land trusts have a very specific, unique purpose. For example, in southern Indiana, there's the Indiana Karst Conservancy, whose mission is to protect caves and karst landscapes. There's another land trust down near Clarksville, New Albany, Indiana, that's called George Rogers Clark Land Trust. Its sole mission is to protect ag land. It's not worried about green space, it's protecting food production and ag land. What land trusts do? They provide a lot of positive outcomes. They help protect clean water. They protect habitat, fight impacts of climate change. Some work in urban areas, some work in rural areas, some work in both. Most get started through the generosity of individual private landowners, and many of those land trusts have properties open to the general public. I mentioned earlier the amount of acreage that's protected through private land trusts across the country. It exceeds our 63 national parks. It also, if you cobbled it all together, would be greater than the land area of the state of Nebraska. The Land Trust Alliance was sort of our umbrella professional organization, conducted a survey in 2020. And at that time, 61 million acres of land was being preserved through private land trusts. 16.7 million visits, almost 10,000 miles of trail, and that's usually nature trail, hiking trail. There may be some paved trails, but primarily nature trails. They provide programs to 6.4 million visitors, and at that time, 1,281 individual land trusts nationwide. Here in Cincinnati, you may have heard of some of these organizations. 5 land trusts, and there are more in the metropolitan area, serving the greater Cincinnati area. The Hillside Trust, which is one of those kind of unique mission-focused land trusts, its purpose is really to protect landslide-prone hillsides here in Cincinnati. It was created in the 70s and early 80s, and as an advocacy group to help educate planners, urban planners, regional planners, architects, engineers on the sensitivity of our hillsides here in Cincinnati, and then ways to protect them. Over time, Hillside Trust has acquired conservation easements and property in fee, and has done a marvelous job in sort of turning the tide of appropriate development on our critical hillsides. These 4 other land trusts also serve Cincinnati area. I mentioned farmland protection. Now, a lot of farmland, the early days with land trust farmlands were being protected in New England. It was kind of the cutting edge thing. Here's a photo of a Maine. But even here in Ohio, Cardinal Land Conservancy is protecting ag land, particularly in its counties in the northern part of its service area. So Cardinal serves a 7-county area in southwest Ohio. Warren and Clinton counties have some phenomenally productive agricultural lands. And in partnership with the Ohio Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Cardinal is able to leverage public funds to private property owners so that they can preserve their farmland in perpetuity. And Cardinal holds conservation easements to protect those land as a third-party kind of enforcer of that. Cardinal has 55 conservation easements covering over 8,400 acres. Most of that's ag land protection. But they also protect nature preserves. They have 13 individual nature preserves. 4 or 5 of those are now open to the public and accessible by hiking or special events. You've all heard of the Little Miami River. Well, there's a Little Miami Conservancy, which was created about 56 years ago for the sole purpose to protect the Little Miami River, and at that time, advocate for its designation as a national wild and scenic river, and subsequently the same designation through the state of Ohio. But its focus is the river itself, and to protect the river, they've learned you really need to protect the edge of that river, the riparian corridor, the land that butts up to it, the tributaries feeding into it. So they do own conservation easements along the river. They do own individual properties in fee, but those aren't park properties per se. It's all about protecting the river so that when we canoe or kayak down the stream, we're in a clean river with a relatively wild and scenic vista the entire length of that stream. Oxbow Inc. is an organization that's focused solely on wetland and floodplain protection. So the Oxbow is geographically located in the very southwest tip of Ohio, the very southeast corner of Indiana, at the confluence of the Great Miami and Ohio rivers. So it's near Lawrenceburg. Part of the Oxbow is in the city of Lawrenceburg, straddles the state line into Ohio. Some of the land butts up to Shawnee Lookout Park, which is part of Great Parks of Hamilton County. Great Parks has acquired conservation easements. So over the span of about 30 years, Oxbow, Great Parks are now protecting about 3,500 acres of floodplain and farmland and forested area at the confluence of those two rivers. That's important because wetlands are a vanishing ecosystem, and so protecting them is critically important. We're also in what's called the North American flyway. So for migratory waterfowl that summer in northern United States, Canada, travel down the Great Miami, the Little Miami to the Ohio River, kind of follow those river systems all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, where they spend the winters in Central America. So during migration season, spring and fall, birders will count 200 to 300 individual species coming through the Oxbow area because it's being protected. Some land trusts across the country will focus on urban areas, protecting greenways. This is obviously sort of a conceptual drawing, but here in Cincinnati, Hamilton County, we have an example of that with the Western Wildlife Corridor. Western Wildlife Corridor was established in the early 1990s. Their focus is solely that hillside area that adjacent to the Ohio River from Sedamsville, Mount Echo Park, all the way down to the Indiana line at Shawnee Lookout. So if you've driven US 50 from downtown Cincinnati to say Sailor Park, you'll notice in some areas the hillside is just seems almost vertical and really, really close to the river itself. That's considered the narrows from a geographic standpoint, a physiographic standpoint of the Ohio River. And the Western Wildlife Corridor is trying to protect as much as that hillside, that Western Wildlife Corridor that follows the Ohio River from Cincinnati all the way to Indiana. They have a nature preserve called Kirby Nature Preserve. It's open to the public, and 2 or 3 of their other properties have trails and are accessible to the general public. So these land trusts, like most land trusts across the country, have a lot of things in common. They're advocates for their particular ecosystem and habitat type, what they're trying to protect. Often they provide public access through trails, they provide public programming, hikes, and so forth. And Heritage Conservancy shares a lot of those similar stories, if you will. We focus on protecting natural areas, forest, meadows, wetlands, and where possible, river corridors. So Oak Heritage has a very large service area for a relatively small organization. We are operated by a volunteer board of directors. We have 8 board members and 1 paid staff person who works part-time. And we're covering 12 counties in southeast Indiana. We cover the 5 counties that follow the Ohio River from Cincinnati to Louisville, and then 6 or 7 counties northward up the I-65 corridor to Seymour, working back across eastward towards Cincinnati. So it's a relatively large service area. This map is actually not up to date. We now own property in Floyd County, which is just north of Louisville, kind of to the white space left of that lower county. Our mission and our board's focus is really preserving land for public good. Because we are so small and really volunteer driven and require on donations and funding, the board's motive right now that is, if we can only acquire land to protect it for the future, that's pretty good. That's a good day. Where we can, we try to bring the public into our properties, but the number one priority, preserving land for public good, for our children, our grandchildren, and the generations that follow. Second, getting people outside. So we're focusing on bringing people into some of our preserves. We do some amount of programming, but the thinking here is if you get people into the woods, into nature, they'll begin to understand it, particularly young people. And if they begin to understand it, they begin to appreciate it and probably give it some value, identify its importance. Because if the next generation doesn't identify the importance of protecting nature, natural resources, and special areas, then who will? We've got to make sure the next generation embraces this and sees the value of it and takes the baton in the future. Part of our work is restoring natural areas. So we've acquired property that may have been in ag land in previous generations. So we've worked with local partners to plant pollinator habitat. We work to remove invasive species, either on our own or through grants and special projects, but restoring natural areas so that there is a bit of that unique landscape that was more common 100, 150 years ago than it is today. So I'd like to share with you a little bit of a tour of some of our preserves. We have 15 nature preserves And we also have 3 properties under conservation easement. So we're protecting about 1,200 acres across our service area. And 60% of that is nature preserves that we own in fee, and the other 40% or so is privately owned property where the owners have donated a conservation easement to guarantee its protection in perpetuity. So we're going to take a little tour of about 5 of our preserves. And the interesting thing about all of our preserves, they all come with a very interesting story or background or history. So Webster Woods is a nature preserve located in Jefferson County. Madison, Indiana is the county seat of Jefferson County. Hanover College is in Jefferson County. And Webster Woods is about a 40-acre forest just 6 miles west of Hanover. It was actually donated to Oak Heritage in about 2006 or so. The previous owner was Dan and Juanita Webster. They bought the property in the 1970s. It was sort of a refuge for them to escape. Dan was a biology professor at Hanover College. He eventually started taking his classes out to Webster, to the forest, when he privately owned it, to educate students on what a true old-growth forest looks like. So he I'm sure he inspired a lot of students by doing that. Eventually, he learned about Oak Heritage, and they donated it to Oak Heritage, and it became our very first nature preserve. Guthrie Woods is in Jennings County. North Vernon is in Jennings County. Vernon is actually the county seat of Jennings County. But Guthrie Woods was owned by a couple named William and Sarah Guthrie. And they acquired it, I think, in the late 1800s, maybe around the turn of the century. And it was another safe space for them and their families. Apparently, Mr. Guthrie was a leader in Indiana at the time. He was part of a group of individuals that helped establish the concept of Indiana state parks. He had some affiliation with Clifty Falls State Park, a couple other state parks, so he certainly was a conservationist. They acquired this property, and in about 1927, almost 100 years ago, when Mr. Guthrie passed and his wife had already died, he bequeathed this 65-acre forest to a private trust, literally a bank trust. Not a conservation trust, but he, in his will, stipulated that it was to remain preserved in perpetuity and no trees be harvested. Well, it stayed in the control of a land trust. It got handed off to a sort of a nature club. Eventually, the Heritage Conservancy took ownership of the property, I think in the 1970s. And then in the early 2000s, the property was transferred to Oak Heritage Conservancy. The cool thing about this property, it's never been timbered in more than 100 years. So you can see this image here, the gentleman, that's a white oak. There are some just humongous white oak trees, shagbark hickories, beech, maple. And when you walk to the center of it, it has very little impact from invasive species. And it really gives you kind of a hint into the past of what flatwood forest in southern Indiana looked like. That's what it's classified as, a flatwood forest. And there's parts of Indiana that are obviously very flat and were mostly harvested timber to convert to agriculture. The unique thing about flatwood forests are they're very wet in the winter and spring. You slosh through there, you're up to your eyelets in your shoes in water, but by July and August it becomes droughty. So if you go out there now, it feels dry as a prairie. So it's a very unique habitat. There are some just giant trees in there. It's a spectacular place to visit. I mentioned it's an old-growth forest. There's a number of different wildflowers. It is part of the Indiana Division of Nature Preserve system. So Guthrie Woods and another one of our properties called Tribbett's Woods are both classified or designated as Indiana Nature Preserves. And it's a partnership between IDNR and Land Trust to have that designation. And what that means is we have technical support from Indiana DNR about how to manage the property. Should we want to develop a trail, provide parking, then we have to go through DNR for approval because they essentially have an easement to help protect it. Hall-Carmer Wetlands, also in Jennings County, really about a mile from Guthrie and about a mile from the Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. If you're familiar with that, it's a 50,000-acre National Wildlife Refuge between Versailles and Madison. It's really a very large green space, and the creek that comes out of Big Oaks eventually makes its way over to Hall-Carmer. Well, the story here, there was a woman named Lillian Hall-Carmer who inherited this 40-acre wetland in addition to about 400 acres of farmland, and from her parents and I think her in-laws. So she, in the 1990s, as recent as that, saw the importance of protecting wetlands, and she worked with the federal government to put this property in the Wetland Reserve Program. While she still owned it, before it became an Oak Heritage property, she subsequently passed. The entire farm went to her nieces, and they kind of wanted to honor her wishes and eventually cut out the 40 acres, donated it to Oak Heritage, and now we're the steward of this wetland complex there in Jennings County. And if I had an aerial photo, you would see this 40-acre patch of forest surrounded by flat, highly productive agricultural land. So it literally is an island in an ag territory. Hilltop Farm Nature Preserve is the preserve closest to where we are today. It's probably really about 25 minutes from just out I-74. It's located in West Harrison, Indiana, literally about a mile from the Ohio state line, Hamilton County. This is our largest preserve. It is 119 acres. It was donated by a couple in the early 2000s, 2006, I believe. The individual not only gave us the property, they bequeath a cash contribution to our stewardship fund. So they've helped us sort of continue to manage the property by leaving Oak Heritage a cash gift as well. We now have 2.5 miles of nature trails. We have a 4-car gravel parking lot, and there's about a 20-acre pollinator habitat that you're looking at there that was restored about 6 or 7 years ago. So it's a great place to go out in the summertime, see butterflies, bees, all sorts of pollinators, but hiking year-round is very enjoyable. And the last preserve I want to talk about is what we call Monarch Meadows. It's located just outside of Rising Sun in Ohio County. It's 85 acres. This was actually purchased by Oak Heritage. It wasn't a gift. And the story behind this property is a volunteer that was involved with Oak Heritage drove by literally one day in the summer and saw all this butterfly weed. So what you see there, that orange wildflower, is called butterfly weed, and it's very important for monarch habitat purposes. She stopped, she wandered through there, and literally that summer saw hundreds, if not thousands, of monarch caterpillars. Well, she later learned the property was going up for sale. She and her sister got permission. They went out there and they collected as many caterpillars as they could, and they transferred them to other Oak Heritage properties and probably her property. But that was a catalyst to see that in bloom, to see all those caterpillars, and a light bulb went off with that volunteer, and she recruited some other people. They found a very generous donor who was willing to make a significant contribution, kind of in a 4-to-1 match, and with a quick fundraising effort between what was probably August and the property was going up for sale by auction. And actually in December of 2017, Oak Heritage was able to purchase this property at auction to protect it. And it was really because of a few volunteers and a few very generous donors. Again, it's 85 acres, and it's primarily spectacular in June, July, August when the wildflowers are in bloom. This is all native butterfly weed. The Oak Heritage has added maybe 15 or 20 acres of additional planting for wildflower purposes. So it's just a really different landscape, again, among a relatively rural area in southern Indiana. For the last 3 years, we've been working, Oak Heritage has been working on an effort to make as many of its preserves a little more welcoming and inviting to the public. Again, most of our preserves don't have parking lots. In fact, some of them are along county roads that, because deep ditches, don't even have really safe parking on the roadway. So a lot of these properties are just being protected, and it's hard to get the public out there. But we've identified 6 or 7 of the preserves that can have some amount of development that will bring the public in. So with a generous grant from a private foundation about 3 years ago, Oak Heritage secured a 3-year trail building project. We're nearing the end of year 3, so we're seeing the fruits of our labor and people are getting out. But we have 4 new nature trails. I mentioned Webster Woods, Hilltop. Riverview is a very small preserve down near Hanover. And then Glenwood Knobs was a gift that came to us about 2 years ago, and it's near Sellersburg, Indiana, which is just north of New Albany. So we have 4 new nature trails. We're working on a project, hopefully underway this fall, to provide a boardwalk with ADA access to that Hall Carmer wetlands. So we plan to put in a small gravel lot, a short little boardwalk for a viewing area over the wetlands. We've added interpretive signage. We've been able to hire college interns the last 3 summers to help do a lot of the labor and grunt work, if you will. We've had them upgrade older wood-routed signs, add new identifying signs, and also kind of on the project planning calendar is to develop a preserve and trail guide, a PDF that will go on our website, and hopefully a printed material that we can bring to events like this that people can kind of see and feel encouraged or hopefully even enthusiastic to come out and see some of our properties. So I've just got a few more slides to wrap up, and I'll be glad to take any questions that you may have, but I just want to share there are ways you can have fun with Oak Heritage, at least 3, and spend more time in nature. And number 1 would be come to our events. Now we're small, we don't have a lot of events, but we have one about once a quarter. It might be a nature hike at Hilltop. It might be a social event at a brewery on an evening where you can kind of enjoy a cold beverage. In fact, in July we had an event called Butterflies and Beer, where in the afternoon we did a butterfly hike at Monarch Meadows, and then starting at 6 o'clock, Great Crescent Brewery in Aurora kind of hosted us and donated a portion of their taproom sales back to Oak Heritage. We also do volunteer cleanup events. We have an annual gathering coming up in October. That's our kind of end of year fundraising event, which is a ticketed event. But check our website if you're interested, and hopefully we'll see you out there. A second way, if you live near or wanted to travel to one of our preserves on a routine basis, we are always looking for volunteers. And so what is a preserve steward? Well, it's really someone who would visit the property. If we have a trail, commit to hiking the trail maybe as much as 2 times a month, maybe not even that much part of the year. Have an extra set of eyes on the ground. If there's trash to be picked up, pick that up. If a tree has fallen across the trail, let me know about it, or another volunteer. It's just helping us kind of keep an extra set of eyes on all those properties. Again, small volunteer-based organization, 12 counties, 15 nature preserves, there's a lot of land to cover. And then finally, maybe the simplest thing is become a member. And I've got brochures in the back of the room. Feel free to take one on your way out. We'd love to increase our membership base. It's relatively inexpensive, but you can get on our e-newsletter list, find out about what's happening with us and what's happening in the future. So with that, I thank you very much. I'll be glad to take any questions you may have about Oak Heritage. Yes, sir, and I'll try to repeat them for the recording.
So, Great Oaks, it's not a part, Great Oaks Preserve north of Madison.
That is called, it's Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge, and it is part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So that's a federally owned property.
Because my dad worked there when it was a munitions plant. Is it open to the public or parts of it all?
Yes, so the question was, is Big Oaks Nature Preserve open to the general public? And you are correct, sir. It is actually still owned by the U.S. military. So it was called the Jefferson Proving Grounds. And I, as a kid growing up in Aurora, Indiana in the 1960s, could actually hear munitions being exploded from 40 miles away. But it's still owned by the military, and there's actually parts of that are cordoned off because there are still live munitions buried in the forest. But it is open to the public. You have to go through a security check. They allow hunters to come in by lottery. There are areas that the general public can come and visit, but you have to go through their security check. Now, I'll give them a plug because this Saturday they have an event called Old Timbers Lodge Day. There's a spectacular old sort of stone lodge building where they let the public come in. You don't have to go through a 30-minute training session on how to be safe at Big Oaks, but it's a great way to see part of the preserve. And then sections of the Jefferson County Proving Ground are now owned. County Park for Jefferson County has a public park in there that's separate from the national part. You don't have to go through the security checks. There's some privately owned property in there as well.
One other thing about, I was just thinking this the other night about right-of-ways for creeks or rivers. If they go through private land, can you still use those creeks and rivers?
Well, the question was, when a river or stream basically navigates through private lands, which most of them do across the country, I know here in Ohio and Indiana, the law is if you're floating in a canoe or a kayak and you stay on the stream, that's public domain. That's a public right-of-way. However, if you choose to step off and step on the shoreline, you may be trespassing on private property. I'm sorry?
Well, the islands are public domain. I've been on a commercial trip where they said the island, the Scotland Islands, banks are public property.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with. I know there are islands. In fact, in the Ohio River, there are some islands that are part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. But typically, if you're in a flowing stream and you're in the stream or in the middle of the stream, it's okay.
Looking at any other acquisitions?
Actually, believe it or not, the rewarding thing for me, again, I've been with Oak Heritage about 18 months. I literally will receive an email or a phone call almost about once a month from a private landowner who wants to have a conversation about how they might see their property protected. Some are very generous and are willing to donate the property under certain terms. Some are looking to sell the property at market value or even at a bargain value. But remarkably, we're seeing people, and it's typically what I'm noticing is kind of individuals of an older generation, older than me, that are looking at their assets and realizing that their family may not want that, or they may not have family, or maybe they don't even live in Indiana anymore. We've had calls from people in North Carolina that still own property in Jefferson County. So we have conversations monthly. We actually have a couple of conversations underway as a potential land donation in Ripley County that may come to fruition next year. The family wanted to take care of some things before finalizing things. We have another property owner in Dearborn County that is interested in a potential bargain sale. So she wants to see her property protected, but she has some financial limitations and can't just give the property to Oak Heritage. So yes, it's encouraging and rewarding to know there are a lot of people out there who still want to see their property protected some way or the other.
You were talking about conservation easements on farmland. So I guess if you own a farm, you can put an easement on and say it has to remain agricultural land and cannot be developed. With regards to, we pass on to a different owner, they can maintain this farmland.
Yes, so the question related to conservation easements on farmland or ag land. And the way those work is once a private property owner conveys that conservation easement, then they're basically creating deed restrictions on the deed itself. That when that property owner either passes, sells the property, bequeaths it to a family member or whomever, those restrictions are a restricted covenant that stay with the property, with the deed in perpetuity. So in all candor, that creates, and the way those are done, they're basically donated to a nonprofit land trust as a public charity that we can accept those, or other land trusts can accept those. But then the burden is on that land trust to enforce the terms of those easements. And that can be a challenge if a second owner or third owner down the line either doesn't understand the terms of the easement, maybe doesn't agree with the terms of the easement, or just wants to ignore them altogether. It creates a potential conflict between the easement holder, the land trust, and the individual private landowner. So whether it be for agriculture purposes or protecting it as green space, it's a tool in the toolbox for land trusts to use, but there are some challenges, potential challenges down the road.
So if someone puts a conservation easement on a strawberry farm, it has to be strawberry fields forever.
Well, that would be how the question was, if a conservation easement is placed on a strawberry farm, would it have to remain strawberry farm forever? Strawberry fields, excuse me. The devil is in the detail. It's how that conservation easement is drafted and agreed upon by the donor, the landowner, and the receiving land trust. So you're basically, as described to me once by an attorney, is when you own a property, a physical asset, real estate, you own all the rights to basically do pretty much what you want with that under, local law. But if you're giving up some of those rights, you have to agree to yourself and put it into a contract that I'm giving away these rights, the rights to develop it, and retaining other rights, maybe the rights to hunt or harvest timber in a appropriate manner. But if the contract says this property will remain strawberry fields forever, and everybody agrees to that, well, that's the restriction you just placed on it.
What do you do if there's a property that has buildings
Question is, what would we do if we received a donated property that had structures or buildings on it? Ideally, I think it would be a case-by-case decision. Number one, do those structures have any value to advance the mission of Oak Heritage or that land trust? And in some cases they might, but in many cases they probably don't. So we would need to go into that donation acceptance understanding that we may need to demolish a house, a barn, some outbuildings. We may find there was buried junk. Farmers in days of old would often bury their junk and old automobiles in gullies as erosion control. There's a sort of a lot of hidden landmines or hidden secrets out there. So that's a risk the land trust takes, is when they accept it and they want to manage that property for conservation purposes, there may be some costs associated with doing that. Demolition, restoration, those kinds of things. Yes, sir.
When a tree falls over a trail, what do you do with fallen trees? Do you let them decay naturally, or do you use this firewood, or perhaps maybe use it for wood projects? I actually made this out of a tree from my backyard.
Awesome.
Is that what you do in your
Well, the question was, when a tree falls across a trail, or literally when it falls in the woods, what would we do with it? Typically, we'll want to basically cut the trail open again and let the tree lie and decay. So there's their old story, what good is dead wood? Well, there's a lot of good with dead wood. It decomposes, it creates habitat for insects and regenerates soil and so forth. It's possible a land trust might want to cut up part of it for firewood. We've actually had a property owner that said, I don't want you to harvest, I'm going to donate my land to you. I don't want you to harvest it commercially, but if a large white oak falls and you can pull it out and sell that, then I don't have objections. So, there are a lot of uses for that. Having creative woodworkers associated with us would be a great thing too.
Yeah, this is actually Norway maple, which is actually not a native tree. It's been considered as an invasive tree. If it's Norway maple, it could be considered Norwegian wood.
Very good. Yes, sir.
Is the Arc of Appalachia a land trust also?
Yes, I believe it is, meaning that it's a nonprofit organization that is a public charity and can, acquire lands for public use. So I think they would fall under that umbrella as a land trust. I'm sorry. The gentleman asked, the Arc of Appalachia, which is a large group of holdings on the east of Cincinnati over towards Brown County and central Ohio, would they be considered a land trust? And I believe they would.
Edge of Appalachia is jointly owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy and the Cincinnati Museum.
Right. The comment from the gentleman is he mentioned the Edge of Appalachia, which is different from the Arc of Appalachia, is co-managed by the Museum Center here in Cincinnati as well as the Nature Conservancy. Well, if there are no other questions, let me thank you once again. I appreciate your patience tonight and allowing me to present.
That's all right. Thank you so much, Jack. I've got a longer list of things to explore when my knee recovers. Thank you all for being here. We have an exciting fall lineup coming up. Next month, on Wednesday, October 4th, we will welcome back Colin Thornton, who is a previous organizer for Science on Tap. Colin is looking for a way to merge his two passions of science and improv. So I don't know what the topic's going to be yet, but we'll let you know. It should be fascinating. In November, we will have Dr. Bayless from the University of Cincinnati to come talk about the James Webb Telescope, and I'm sure he's going to have fascinating slides for us. Lastly, we were working on a fun collaborative project with a local artist for December, so we're going to mix art and science, and we hope to see you there. Remember to follow Radio Artifact on YouTube and Twitch. You can follow Science on Tap on Facebook at Science on Tap Cincinnati. Thank you all for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you on October 4th.